I want to talk about the role of science in our world views and the way that we come to our various beliefs about the world. Now, I believe that what has happened is science has basically become a new religion all of its own. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm very much a rationalist. I'm strongly in favour of the scientific endeavour. But I think many people have misunderstood what it's really about. Now, the whole point of science, or the origin of science anyway, is that we had doubt about the world. It's like we didn't necessarily believe what we'd been told about the gods causing the famine or what have you. And we started to notice patterns, and we doubted that the existing explanation was correct. So we explored and we investigated. And this willingness to doubt and to not be sure of how things are is the very bedrock of the scientific endeavour. So it's kind of ironic when people take science as basically like a set of religious precepts, like this is true, this is true, this is true, that can't be true. And they fail to realise that actually what science gives us is a best current model for how things are. And a genuine scientist, in my view, will understand that, and they will have the humility, and they'll say that the evidence suggests this is the case, this is the best explanation we have. I'm not going to put my life on the line and say this is absolutely how it is, because that would be stupid, because our views can change. For example, the size of the universe has changed. That's just one classic example. It was so big, and then it was bigger, and then it was bigger, and now apparently even the Big Bang Theory is in question. Not necessarily the whole theory, but the age when it happened. The original theory is 13 point something billion years ago, and I saw something recently that actually maybe it's twice that. And another classic one would be the atomic model. So we all know the world's made of atoms, right? But you need to understand atoms are a model. No one's seen an atom. We can't actually physically perceive an atom. We can only infer that model from the data that we have. And of course, that model has evolved over time. So we had, first of all, I think it was protons, neutrons and electrons, and then we got subatomic particles. That couldn't happen, but it did happen. And I'm going a little bit out of my depth now, but I believe the subatomic particles themselves can be sometimes waves and sometimes particles, and that was a new a new piece of the picture. And then the role that the observer plays in that is like, oh, we didn't know that. We thought things were just static, and now we got this kind of interplay between observation and behavior. So I think it's great to embrace science, but to recognise its limits, and also to recognise the questions that it can't answer. So there's this concept called falsifiability, which I think it was Karl Popper that came up with this. I might be wrong about that. But the idea is, if you couldn't provide me with solid, compelling evidence to disprove my theory, then it's not really the realm of science to be asking the question in the first place. So, for example, does God exist? How would you design an experiment that could falsify that fact? It doesn't mean the question isn't valid, but it means science is not really the right tool to answer that. And there's so many of these kind of questions that people, they believe that science has given the answer, like that can't be real, like there's no, all sorts of things that people reject out of hand because they're not scientific, which in fact may well be true. And it just comforts them to be certain in a way that science doesn't actually justify them to be. And just one more dimension to that is that science has many definitions. There's an element of it which is social and political, and all sorts of questions around funding and vested interests and all of that, they affect it. Okay, so there's a difference between what the data is and how we might interpret that, and then how that data was collected, why it was collected, what other data wasn't collected that maybe ought to have been collected, and all of this. And the bottom line is, I guess someone said it much better than me. Rupert Sheldrake talked about the 10 delusions of science. So we have these axioms basically in science. One of them is constants. Okay, so there's physical constants in the universe, and we have no way of knowing if they are actually constant. In fact, the values that we have are composite mean values of various readings that have changed, and it's a kind of consensus reality. So they're not really constants in that sense. And there's other ones like, the universe is not conscious, and it's like, well, we don't know that. And some of them are quite wacky, but the point is they're held in the same way as like commandments for people who I would label as scientistic rather than scientific. The distinction being the scientistic people treat their science as if it were a religion. And to me, that's kind of anti-science. So it's funny, you kind of get almost the opposite, people claiming to be one thing who are in fact exhibiting the very opposite approach to life. So there's some thoughts on science and scientism.